So it's really with great pleasure that I'm here to introduce the three presenters for this film that's really so important. I'm a homesteader. I've been with my husband, a part of the Eat Local campaign for 20 some odd years and recognize how important local food, food sovereignty, food security is for us. So it's really great that we're having this workshop. So I'm going to introduce first Brian Deans. He's the founder of Olsiri and host of the Indigenous Wisdom and Permaculture Skills Convergence. On his permaculture demonstration site, he was born on Pine Ridge Reservation, who's a Oglala Lakota, and he has been an incredible community resource for over 20 years. And he's skilled in permaculture design and integrating these teachings with his understanding of the Lakota ways. And Niaz Dory has been a community organizer for over 30 years. The life-changing moment came in 1994 when, as a Greenpeace campaigner, she switched from organizing in communities fighting for environmental justice to organizing fishing communities. From the start, she recognized the similarities between family farmers' fight for a more just and ecologically responsible land-based food system and that of community-based fishermen fighting to fix the broken sea-based food system. And she will talk about the work that she has been doing with the North American Marine Alliance. And we also have Molly Anderson here with us. She's the William R. Kennan Jr. Professor of Food Studies at Middlebury College in Vermont. She's interested in multi-actor collaborations for sustainable food systems, food system resilience, human rights in the food system, and the right to food in the US, and bridging interests and concerns of academicians and community-based activists. And Molly and I have known each other for quite a few years. I chose her as a presenter here because I had seen the work that she's done and had been in workshops with her and learned so much. So it's just such a pleasure to have the three of you here. And so I want to start with a question. As you know, the theme of this is the regenerative communities, and that stating the obvious that localization of food is the step-by-step process of reestablishing regional growing and production of nutritious, authentic food for family, friends, and communities. I'd like to know, about 5 minutes each, how your work relates to the theme, the regenerative communities theme. So why don't we start with Niaz?
Hi, everyone. Thanks, Rua. It's nice to be with everybody here. And I want to say a special hello to my friend Scott Brown, who is in the audience. When I was at Greenpeace, Scott and I worked on environmental justice issues together many moons ago. So wow. To be connected with them. So how does our work connect to the regenerative economies, regenerative theme of this conference? Well, I have to admit, I find the word regenerative as sort of a new word, a little, what's the word I'm looking for? It almost feels like it's the trendy word these days, when in fact, the concept of regenerative food production, whether it's agriculture or fisheries or forestry, it's really learning from the wisdom of the past. There's nothing really that new about the concept. We just have decided to name it something new. A while ago, when Molly and I started with Food Solutions New England, which is a regional network. I kept hearing about network building. And after I heard it a few times, I thought, oh, you're actually just talking about organizing. I get it. If we have a new word for something that's resonating with folks and takes us back to the root of that issue, then great. And I feel that's what regenerative agriculture or fisheries or forestry is really all about. It's going back to the wisdom of the past to learn from that and apply it to today. Our work connects to that in the sense that I wear a big hat. Some might say two hats, but I would like to call it a big hat. And within it fits two organizations. One is the North American Marine Alliance, where we work with community-based fishermen. And the other is the National Family Farm Coalition, where we work with family farmers. And we're together in a concept we call a shared leadership model, where our two organizations share leadership, share the back of the house services, but our work remains somewhat separate, and we capitalize on the synergies there. And I think just that concept of shared leadership in and of itself is a regenerative effort. It's a way to make sure we get the work done without using too much resources and unnecessary resources. But the work itself, we really look at what kind of fishing, farming, forestry, ranching practices sustained us in the past. And we let go of them because we decided that the concepts that things like the Green Revolution brought, efficiency, consolidation, concentration, globalization, all of it rooted in the concepts of that were born out of neoliberal policies, in a sense, that we let go of what we knew because we were given new words, we were given new concepts, and we were told those are better. Those are the concepts that are going to feed people. They're the ways of creating the kind of efficiencies to get rid of hunger and to eliminate, the waste that comes in the number of boats or the number of farms. And what did we get out of that consolidation, out of that green revolution, and now applied to fisheries is the blue revolution, which is what we got was erosion of land, food that for the first time in our history is actually killing us instead of healing us. We saw loss of integrity in our communities, in rural communities, whether they're fishing, forestry, or agriculture, or ranching. And we saw essentially flight of people from rural communities to urban areas, and with it went a lot of knowledge, and with it went our ability to feed ourselves from regional systems that are really truly sustainable and regenerative. So our work is really to restore that, whether that is through community-based fishing operations and setting up economic systems such as community-supported fisheries that are really focused on bringing that economic wealth back to the community instead of having the wealth leave the community. It's about looking at our food system and how we feed ourselves in kind of concentric circles where we start with where we are, and as there is food left, you go further and further and further out and distribute that food, not because we're xenophobic or we don't think everybody deserves food, but because we believe that everyone else has the ability to feed themselves if we give them back the resources that concepts like the Green Revolution and industrialization and consolidation took away from our communities, whether that's seeds or land or fishing rights or infrastructure. I think once communities, not only here locally, but around the globe, have access to things that were stolen from them, people are very capable of feeding themselves, and we don't have to bring this "here we are to save the world" attitude to communities, but in fact, all we need to do is give them back what was taken away. So that's what our work is really rooted in. We have we're North American based in both organizations. We have international connections through La Via Campesina, which is the international movement of the peasants, and the World Forum of Fisher People. And those two organizations keep us connected to the global elements of our work because we can't be local without keeping an eye on the global. And so being connected in that way really keeps us whole and keeps us focused on the long game as well as the short-term strategies.
Wow. You have your work cut out for you, huh?
I think that's the work of all of us. I think we're all doing it in our own little ways, and in many ways, our job as activists, as advocates, as whatever you call yourselves, is to figure out where do we fit and what can we bring. And that's the most effective way I know to be sufficiently whelmed and continue to do the work that needs to be done.
That's great. Thank you, Niaz.
Thank you.
How about you, Brian? What can you share about the work that you're doing and also how it's related to regeneration?
SERI is a acronym for Oglala Lakota Cultural Economic Revitalization Initiative. And most of the work that I do comes from a lot of memories from the tribal peoples. And what we're doing is kind of a large translation of, and like as Oglala Lakota people, we were, our whole world was based around the buffalo. And with our bioregional things that have happened here, I mean, the reservation has, and this system has existed since 1868. And, you know, the collapse of our bioregional systems has happened over the last 250 years, roughly. And so we're some of the last people to have stopped warfare with the Euro-Western incursion that happened. And so, and this is really only about 3 generations that we've moved out of that. So as Lakota people, and we have a unique place in history because we won our wars against the United States. So we have a bigger claim to our treaty territories. And we're able to go and reach back and grab the knowledge a little fresher than anybody else. Is like in our region, it's not even quite 250 years that all of this has happened. Where on the East Coast, it's a little over 400 years. And so they're quite a few, you know, they're 2 or 3 generations further along with European influence on the lands. And the memories are in the peoples. We're able to go and kind of reach into the ceremony. We're able to reach into the memories of the people that existed here before. So, and like the lady prior, she was talking about how we're using these knowledges to further the whole thing. Money is new to us relatively, 250 years, because and we were never a poor people, and we never had money. And so I'm able to come at this from a different standpoint than a lot of folks. Like in establishing the 77300, this establishes our long game for 300 years. You know, planning for the next 7 generations. We're not going, and the first 5 is food, fire, water, shelter, earth, spirit, and self. That's Maslow's hierarchy. These are things that all people will have in common. And then the last 2 are the less tangible. That's, you know, the spiritual and the educational pieces of your self-development. Or Lakota, we call it Nagi, the spirit. So we don't focus too much on the financial aspects of it because that's like a redundancy that happens in all the other things. Instead, what we're reaching out for is over the next 300 years, we make an agreement amongst all peoples that we're not going to negatively affect, you know, the ability to produce food, the ability to for energy. You know, that's a need that's common to all folks. And water, you know, this gives us a litmus test for what is good and what is not. It's a way to measure the things that we as human beings move forward, whether it's good or bad. Because right now, financial interests are changing everything else that's out there, right? Because fracking is okay if you're measuring it by a financial interest, because it's based on profit. However, if you weigh it against these other things, Maslow's hierarchy, food, fire, water, shelter, earth, spirit, self, that's environmental, that's your water. So if you're injecting explosive into the earth and you're blowing the plates apart, and then you're mixing crude oils, natural gas, things like that into the water tables, and this is something we can't fix, we can't change it. So you're affecting all successive generations thereon, and then you make habitable spaces for people, and it's something we can't reverse. So this gives us a litmus test to be able to judge what we do, and we reach out to all the future generations and say, this is our long-term goal, is to have people that can agree that we can't continue this extraction all the time. And so, I mean, we created what was called I drafted it originally, called the Lakota Plan, and that's this long-term agreement. And then other tribes have been to know about that. So then we created CERI, which is a Cultural Economic Revitalization Initiative. And so that's where we collaborate with other tribes to create something like what we're doing here, and just share information. Now that networking is really a key thing, because we need allies. There's 54,000 Oglala Lakota in the world today, down from a little over 3 million originally. And this knowledge, since we're the closest ones to the old knowledge, needs to be disseminated and shared and passed out amongst other folks. And like with all the native peoples that are out across the nation, 544 tribes, they're all bioregional based now, right? So these people lived in these areas for thousands of years. And so they have memories that go back, way back before the European incursion into the North America. And most of them were wiped out, and that knowledge wasn't passed along. So in order to heal or get back to that historical time when it was sustainable, you need that knowledge. And then it's a blending or a translation, because in 250 years, we've been able to destroy our bioregion here in the upper Midwest. And they use equipment and all the power of human ingenuity to get there. So we're not anti technology, but we do advocate for knowledge-based use of that technology. As a permaculturist, I teach this thing about the bison. They were the management thing of our aquifers, our water tables here, and combined with the prairie dogs. Because on the landscapes we had key points, and so it's, as you come down the dendritic branching down off of the hills and things like that, you have all these watersheds that are coming down, and they go down from creeks to rivers to large rivers. And in our areas, our clay soils they seal up if you don't have inputs into the areas. So the buffalo moving through, migrating, they would basically plow the entire areas, and they would strip mostly all of the forage off of the ground, and they would basically till and cultivate the entire prairie. All right. Um, the prairie dogs, since they're this little bitty creature, short legs, and they have no real defenses to other predators, they can't water above ground like the other bigger animals. So they move into key points, which on the prairie are places where, as you're coming down the dendritic branching on the watershed, there's slight places where the underground, the impenetrable layer rises up as you're coming down the slope. And those areas act as water catchment areas. Now, the prairie dogs will move into those areas and they'll burrow down into those so they can water underground. And they're doing several things when they do that. When they burrow into the ground where that water catchment is, water tables, their holes act as large conduit to move water into the ground. And the buffalo, they have their olfactories are able to smell 1,000 times better than a dog. So they're moving across the area. There's no water to be seen, but they can smell the water under the ground on these prairie dog mounds. So animals will get agitated, and about every 20 or so prairie dog mounds, there's one that's larger than all the rest. And that's a community burrow where all these little families of prairie dogs move together, and then they dig it out to get to the water. They all collectively dig into that. And then the buffalo come along and they go to the high spot because there's a little bit of wind there. They can smell it. The bulls will get down on their knees and dig with their horns, and the cows will mill in them places. So this is millions of head of buffalo, large populations. And since the prairie dogs have made that into like this dome, and the buffalo on the inside, the buffalo are working on the outside, wearing this down until boom, it caves in. And then that prairie dog mound is now a buffalo wallow, a spring-fed buffalo wallow. Now, as the water develops, the buffalo are moving down. They don't move like cows. They move with the general topography, and they create trails. And those trails become swale systems to rapidly hydrate the aquifers. So the water off of those watersheds moves down to the prairie dog mounds, and then it goes into the ground very quickly. Now, if you move into the modern management cycle, you don't want the prairie dogs taking all so
You're breaking up a bit,
the
Brian.
grass level.
Brian,
Okay,
Are-
let me see.
is your car, can,
I don't.
this is a great story that you're sharing.
I'll try.
And, but I think we need to also keep moving around and letting Molly. So if you want to finish this piece about the buffalo, and it's showing how nature really works so beautifully and how humans have disrupted that. I really appreciate that. So do you want to finish that cycle? Uh-oh. Are you frozen? Okay, I think Brian's frozen.
Yeah, so anyway, these are the bioregional.
Brian, you're freezing up. Are you traveling?
I'm actually stopped. No, I thought we stopped in a good place.
Right. So maybe you need to find, so let's move on to Molly right now while you kind of straighten that out. Same question to you, Molly, about your work and how it connects to regenerative communities, the theme of our summit. And you're muted, so please unmute yourself.
Okay, I think I'm unmuted now. Can you hear me? Good. At this point in my life, I'm working primarily as a scholar activist and as a teacher. I've done different things at different points in my life. But I work from the local to the global level. And I really like that interaction from local to global. At the local level, some of the ways that I'm connected to regeneration is that I'm on the board of our local food co-op, which I see as an example of a business model that's regenerative. It's really putting wealth back into the community instead of sucking the wealth out like supermarkets generally do. I'm also on the local conservation commission for my town, and we're trying to develop a conservation plan to improve how we as humans are living in this web of life in Middlebury. I'm also working to some extent with a climate economy action coalition that is trying to reduce greenhouse gas emissions from agriculture, mainly in Middlebury. That's the biggest greenhouse gas emitter in Middlebury. And I'm teaching. All of those things are activities at the local level. And then at the regional level, Niaz had mentioned Food Solutions New England. I do some work with them. And right now, the main thing I'm doing is working on a revision of a vision for the New England food system, in which we have decided that it's certainly possible for us to be growing 30% of, or providing 30% of the food that we consume here in New England by the year 2030. And we're revising an earlier plan that we had developed, an earlier vision, to bring it down to 2030. Our original vision was for 2050, and we decided we need to be moving along a lot faster. So now we're at 30% by 2030, which seems very feasible. And I'm excited about that vision. I really think that if we don't have a vision of a better future that is tangible, that we won't get there. We'll just kind of flounder around, and it's really hard to tell. Like Brian was talking about, how he is always checking back for activities, how they, whether they're congruent with these basic principles of Lakota teaching. You need to make sure that you have a vision and then be checking back to make sure that everything you're doing is helping you move toward that vision. So that's something I'm doing at the regional level. And at both local and regional levels, we are explicitly trying to build more inclusive communities by paying particular attention to marginalized people, low-income people, people of color, and indigenous, all of whom are not getting a fair shake in this country now by any means. They've suffered a lot of abuses, and Brian could tell you plenty about the abuses that indigenous people have suffered, but we see it all around us with the fight back against police oppression of Black people, one of the most recent things that's come to national attention. Then at the international level, I'm working both with a group of activists, social movements, and NGOs that are called the Civil Society and Indigenous Peoples Mechanism. It's part of the Committee on World Food Security, and it's a really passionate and committed group of people who are trying to improve policy at the international level. I'm also working at the international level with a group of colleagues that are called the International Panel of Experts on Sustainable Food Systems, and I very much enjoy working with them. We sort of choose the topics that we think are most important to be working on, and right now it's governance of food systems that's really absorbing us. We've worked a lot on agroecology previously because we felt that wasn't getting enough attention. And through these different levels of work, I'm trying to work on regeneration in specific ways directed at regeneration of land through growing food with agroecology. I teach agroecology, and I mentioned that EPES Food, this organization I work with, is writing reports on agroecology, doing research on agroecology, and I'm also working with these activists at the international level to fight for agroecology in policy, which has been really hard, partly because the United States is not on board by any means with agroecology. We're going in the opposite direction with food production in this country. I'm working on regeneration of communities through this New England food vision. So not just regeneration of land, but also regeneration of communities as well as land through the food vision. We're trying to figure out how rural communities can become thriving places again that are really serving people's needs. And then I'm working on the regeneration of the community of scholar activists through my teaching. I'm always trying to push students toward activism, which is sometimes a little bit difficult at a rather conservative liberal arts college like Middlebury, but I see that as every person's responsibility, especially now when we're facing so many major crises that are threatening the survival of the human species and the survival of so many other species. So everybody needs to be an activist. We can't just sit back and say, well, I'm a scholar and I'm disengaged. So I'm always pushing my students into activism. And then finally, I try to work on self-regeneration. I think it's really important to keep that in mind too, as you're trying to regenerate land and communities and everything else around you. You can't do it if you are really drained. So some of my self-regeneration comes through my work with colleagues. I love the activists in the CSM. They give me a lot of energy, and I really love the other scholars and the NGO people who are working in EPES Food. They're just so energetic and creative. So that's a lot of fun. But I also seek self-regeneration by living as lightly as I can in my place and always thinking about, well, what could I do better here so I'm not producing as much waste and I'm not using energy quite as squandering it in the way that the typical American does. I also self-regenerate through gardening. I love that, and it gives me a lot of energy, and I seek inspiration wherever I can find it. So all of those are ways that I'm trying to make sure that I continue to have energy for the work I'm trying to do at this stage in my life. So that's plenty. I'll turn it back to you, Rua.
I don't think you missed any part of anything in that. Well, no, I want to know how you're working in the universe. So let's see. I'm really excited by hearing each of you sharing different pieces of what's so important for a healthy future. And interestingly, Paul Hawken's latest book, Regeneration, just came out this week while we're having the Regenerative Communities Summit. And we tried to get him to come and just say a couple of words, but I was in communication with his son, and he's just like, of course, overbooked everywhere. But he presents 6 frameworks to solve the climate crisis. And in the book, it's separated by food and oceans and, all these different areas. I went right to the food section, of course, to see if I could be inspired. And but it was interesting of these 6 frameworks that the very first one is equity. And that we're not going to solve anything unless we solve the issue of equity. And it feels like the work that you're doing, where it's all about food and regeneration of whether it's marine systems or the water or everything that is related, everybody has to eat well. And Brian spoke to that as well. So I was really impressed and touched that equity was first. And then it was reduce, protect, sequester, influence, and support. So I'm just curious if you can again frame the kind of work that you're doing and what you want to share with the participants here in that framework, at least beginning with equity. And we broke off with you, Brian, because you started to kind of break up that horrible technology thing that happens. And so I would really like to limit each of your responses to about 10 minutes in this. So I'm going to start with you, Brian, because we cut you, or you cut yourself off and then I cut you off because we couldn't get your words. And I'll let you know when you've got about a minute left so that we can get into, everybody gets that and then gets into a conversation with each other and being able to ask the participants asking questions. So you want to start with that around equity, which is so much of what you're doing.
It is. Traditionally, we didn't have a concept of ownership of land. So we were vulnerable to other folks coming into our territories and taking land, right? We have the Oglala Lakota, the Oceti territories are North Dakota, South Dakota, Wyoming, Montana, all the way down to Mankato, Minnesota, part of Colorado. That's 1851, 1868 treaties. And then there's the reservations, which were reserved for peoples of the Oceti and our allies. Now, unceded territories, I mean, the language holds a lot of the answers there. So we retired from the battlefield so that we could learn the white man's ways, go to school. That's how our children wound up in the boarding schools. And our lands, the definition of how we're wards of the state. All natives are wards of the state, with our guardian being the United States government, our derelict guardian. And they hold our assets in trust. Okay, so all the lands since 1851, 1868 generate taxes, which is basically a rent to the unceded owners of the land. The land it's unceded. It's never been bought. It's never been traded for, and it's never been paid for. So all of those lands are held, and most of the monies generated are held in trust at the Washington, D.C. level. So you have an entire set of people that are completely cut off of having any kind of equity in land, because it's paid out to our guardian, and then we're like given an allowance as Indian peoples. Now, we are probably some of the richest people anywhere ever, because these lands are unceded, but we can't access our bank account as long as we have a derelict guardian. So that being said, equity is a huge issue in all of this, because it's really about the administration of the lands. Okay, so the United States government is administering in our stead as our guardian what is okay to do. So as indigenous peoples, you know, a ward becomes of it. They can come of an age. And when they do, then they have to take their estate back and they have to start administering themselves on how that all works. So those unceded territories that we're referring to when we speak, that's where the equity gets straightened out. So this is a huge thing for all the organizers out there, because when we step forward and we take back that guardianship, and we're no longer wards and we're adults now, then we can start to administer our lands. And all these folks that have a land in our unceded territories, they have title deed and all that stuff, they're actually just renters. And when you take back your possession of the land, then those folks, you can go through your renters and decide who you keep and who goes. And like traditionally, the Lakota people, we could make as many Indians as we want. We had a ceremony that was called the making of a relative, and that was about the strength of the people. And so it's like really key that we have an agreement amongst all of the folks that are potential allies and membership. And there's a lot of tricks they put into this, you know, because they gave us citizenship. And as a citizen, you have certain things that you have to live up to. You have to be available for the draft, and you have to pay taxes and all this other stuff. But if you're a status Indian, you don't have citizenship status, but you're a status Indian, then all of this belongs to you, and you become a creditor to the United States. So, I mean, this is a whole bunch of big tricks that they're playing, and they make it really complicated. But I mean, there is a power in the individual, because the Supreme Court says each individual is a sovereign unto their own. Like, this is in reference to every Native person out there. But then when you look at the Lakota people, we are many tribes. We're many peoples, and you could become a Lakota by marriage, by allyship, by whatever. So this is a huge thing, and it's a way to take the power away from these huge corporations. And because even the United States government is a huge corporation. And equity, and that's a way to correct the equity, because now you have somebody that says, no, you will not frack, because it's affecting every generation from here on out. No, you will not do this thing on our territories, because we own it. It is ours. And that's the thing about, you know, what happened up in North Dakota, because we put the United States on notice at that point that they were violating their trust. And from that point, then we just have to figure out a way to extract ourselves from it and fix that equity. So, and if anybody's got a question, I would certainly give it a stab.
We'll definitely open this up to questions, and people can put them in the chat, but we'll have a whole question and answer period at the end of your sharing.
Yeah,
So, thank you.
I'm hoping that, that, you know, if the networking that's going on amongst the tribes, amongst the people, and it's like race doesn't really play into the whole thing, because this is kind of like the earth-based people, as opposed to the folks that are not connected. That, you know, there's extractive forces everywhere, and there's a bottlenecking of, I mean, these corporations, these CEOs, these billionaires and trillionaires now, I mean, a billion is like almost a amount that I can't fathom. And then you do a billion billions. I mean, I can't even begin to understand that kind of thing. These guys are like these dragons laying on a mountain of gold, and nobody can eat because there is nothing left over, you know? And so that's where the equity really affects us, is
Right.
because like if you dammed up a swamp and all those life waters that have flown down so far, it becomes stagnant and brackish, and it becomes disease infested, and it kills everything around it. But you undam that swamp and you let the life forces of the planet flow, then there's enough for everybody, and there's vibrant life. Those edge areas become extremely abundant, and we're able to move forward, and everybody does well, except for the grand dragons laying on their mountains of gold, you know?
That is very well said, Brian, and it's about time now to go to somebody else. But that was really very powerfully said. Thank you. So right on. Niaz, equity in your work and all the other reduce, protect, sequester, influence, and support, those frameworks. What do you have to share?
I'm still visualizing what Brian was talking about.
Oh,
My brain needs to let go of those images before I can figure out my own. Or maybe I'll just carry them with me. Well, it's interesting that he ranked them in a sense in that way, with equity being on top, if he did in fact rank them. Because to me, all the other things flow out of equity. They don't, they're not separate. There's this circular element to all of it. And I have to give some props to Food Solutions New England for making me think about equity in a much deeper way than I had when about 10 years ago, the first draft of the vision document that Molly worked on, amongst others, it was pointed out that equity wasn't addressed in it. And we had at the couple of summits, I think the New England Food Summits, we had deep conversations around what does it mean? What does equity really mean? And it made me really dig deep into my own self. What does equity mean? And to reconcile some of the issues I have with race and equity and feeling othered or othering other people, and figuring all of this out as somebody who's from a different culture. I kind of felt like most of the conversations around equity didn't address what I was experiencing. So at first I found myself a little bristled by the conversation until I was humbled by the conversation, and I started to really think about it deeply. So that's 10 years in the works of really beginning to understand what equity means to me, and how equity translates in our work, and how do we practice it in our work. And for me, I'm a visual thinker. That's why I was sort of stuck in Brian's imagery and what he was saying. So for me, first to understand how to bring equity about, I had to really visualize what inequity was all about. And some of what Brian was talking about definitely hits the nail on the head for me. This idea that the more you have, the more you do, the more damage you do, the more land you plow, the more fish you kill, the more animals you hold hostage, the more money you have in your bank account, your zip code, your color, your language, your heritage, all of those things have added to the formula of who is considered to have and who is facing inequities. And so when I visualized that, it was a rancher I met in Montana a couple of years ago. He called the idea of judging productivity based on how much you have and how much you put in, and the more you have to buy, the more you have to extract. He called it the moron way of living, because it's all about more, more, more. And so when I visualize that and I see the trillionaires and the multi-million multinational corporations dominating our land and our fishing rights and our waterways and our livelihoods, then the opposite begins to come into my mind's eye. And so what is the opposite? Is inclusivity. It would be the simple way to say it, but then it shows up in a lot of different ways that we act. And one of those ways is, to me, is equity is about honoring differences. I used to be proud of feeling like I was colorblind. I don't see any differences. And then I realized, oh crap, that actually adds to the inequity people are feeling. I need to actually recognize I'm different than you, and you have a whole different experience than I do. And Brian has a whole different experience than I do. And in those experiences are embedded equities and inequities. So I really have been learning how to take away that color blindness that leads to even more inequity. It's about culture. It's about self-determination. It's about sovereignty. It's about access to multi-layers of resources, whether it's broadband. You know, I was in a conversation with Senator Stabenow from Michigan at an event we had at Farm Aid on Friday. And I think at one point she said, oh yeah, we need broadband, broadband, broadband. And I said, yeah, but if we don't have equity, people who really need it in rural places still won't have access to the rest of the world. So you have to have equity, and you have to honor the need to have equity before you even start talking about broadband. Food that nourishes our DNA is part of equity. You know, we talk about that the inequitable system talks about food as caloric intakes. You know, we want to talk about food as things you feel in your DNA, things you know as soon as you put it in your mouth that something was fed beyond the hunger pain that you've been feeling in your stomach. It's about parity. You know, equity is about having people who are feeding us get paid what they're worth, whether they're workers, whether they're farmers or fishermen or ranchers or the middle of the chain. Right now, inequity shows up in all the profit being hoarded by those who control the middle of the chain. And we have farmers and fishermen committing suicide because they can't make ends meet. And they're forced into ways of life that they don't want to live, which is to, again, grow more and kill more and catch more. And so that, and then there's, of course, racial equity. There is community empowerment. There is economic empowerment. There's just so many ways we can unlock equity in our society and in what we do. We choose to do it in our work in kind of maybe three somewhat simple ways. One is to focus on economic empowerment, to make sure that those who are feeding us are getting paid what they're worth, what their work is actually costing them. If it costs the farmer $5 to put a dozen eggs on our plates, why are we paying them $2.99? And now they have to come up with the other. We've been eating off their backs for way too long. Equity means paying them a fair price. Equity means having land go back to communities where land was stolen. On the National Family Farm Coalition, access to land is a big part of what we do. Equity on the fishing side means fishing rights going back to communities so they can have access to those rights that are now being bought by Wall Street and traded as if they were commodities. These are species of fish that are now becoming somebody's property in perpetuity. And in the name of conservation, in fact, some multinational environmental organizations actually support this kind of consolidation and inequities in our policies because they consider it the more efficient way and therefore must be the right way. And yet they're leading to inequities in our food system. So to me, those are some of the ways we can look for how we can achieve equity. What are those portals that we can work in so that we can have some tangible ways of figuring out what policy changes we need to make to have equity, and then some spiritual ways and some maybe more intangible ways of achieving equity by just honoring each other and who we are and what our heritage is and what our language is and what our culture is. So in some ways, all of that together is what equity is to me and how it shows up in our work.
Thank you so much, Nias. That really was pretty expansive description there. It's beautiful. And I was thinking about the inequity of the availability of healthy food,
Mm.
and what people go and buy in the big supermarkets because it's cheap.
Well, I think that is one of the, all right, I'm very frustrated. I get frustrated often when, as progressives, we are very quick to say, we must not do this. And we forget that it might be easier for those of us with means to not do something than it is with those who don't have means. We say, don't eat that. What if that's all you can get access to? You know, we say, don't go there, don't buy that, don't do that. When some people don't have any choices. In some ways, a choice or lack thereof is a form of inequity or is a lack of equity. And when the only choice you have is a store that sells you what I call unidentified food objects, that is not a choice you made intentionally. That's the choice that was made for you because
Right.
food was used as a political tool, not as nourishment. And so I think to not jump to that, thou must not do this, and realize that choices are privileges in many ways. And a lot of communities that face inequities also don't have the privilege that the rest of us do to make some of those choices because it was made for them and often taken away from them.
And that's the food inequity
That's
situation.
right. And I think some people call it food deserts. And I really love those who popped up right in the chat. I think it's Karen Washington and others who call it food apartheid because of the difference between a desert and apartheid is the intentionality behind apartheid. And what some of the communities who are in what we call food deserts, where they live, because of political decisions, lack of access to food was a choice made for them. The desert is something that happens in natural environment. Lack of access to food didn't happen naturally. It happened politically.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. So I just want to say that I was a single mom with 3 kids back in the 70s and benefited from government surplus food, which was not real food, but there was rice and dried milk and cheese and peanut butter. Those are the ones, and they provided substance, calories, and some good stuff. So I've been there. Thank you. Molly, well, how would you like to share your perspective on equity and food and your work?
Well, I really liked what both Niaz and Brian were saying, really provocative images and words there from both of them. And I guess for me, equity means dignity, it means respect, it means a recognition of each person's uniqueness and intrinsic worth. And it also has to do with making sure that people have choice. What Niaz was getting into toward the end of where she was speaking, that if people don't have choice, that's not equity. To me, human rights are about equity, ensuring that every person has what he or she needs. And equity, for me, is fundamentally opposed to extractivism. What Brian was talking about, the core motive of corporations of extracting more and more and more. I think that multimillionaires are motivated basically by fears of scarcity. And that's the same fear at the base of the moron society that Niaz talked about. It's people who are vainly trying to protect themselves from running out, from not having enough. But it's a sickness. It really is something that we need to recognize in our society as a kind of psychotic break of not being able to release what needs to be given away. A multimillionaire to me is a sick person, a person who has accumulated way too much and is unable to give away that excess. That's far more than any person could ever use. The gift economy, which I became intrigued with maybe, 20, 30 years ago, it's the opposite of this idea of extractivism. The gift economy, the epitome of it is in other Native Americans practice, the people in the Pacific Northwest, they would hold potlatches in which the richest person had the responsibility to hold a big feast and give it all away. And that created a society of abundance where everyone had what they needed because everything was shared. And when a person accumulated too much, that was a signal that it was time for a potlatch. It was time to give it all away. And I know that there's some foundations who go into this thing of spin down, where they are going to give away everything they have. But the simple fact that they accumulated it in the first place, it's because of this sickness in our society where we see wealth as it's something that our society esteems instead of something that we question at all times. Wealth is a sign that people have too much, monetary wealth, at least, what we are accustomed to looking at as monetary wealth. It's too much. And I was really struck earlier what Brian was saying about Native people being treated as wards of the state. I want to go back to that. I thought immediately of this obsession that a lot of people have right now with Britney Spears and her efforts to break her father's conservatorship. And here we are as a country paying attention to Britney Spears and her conservatorship. But why haven't we been outraged by Native people being treated as wards, not being treated as fully adult, being treated as subjects of the state where they have to be patronized? That's outrageous to me. So that's a great example of the lack of equity. It's a lack of treating people with dignity and respect and valuing their intrinsic worth. So that's probably not 10 minutes, but that's what I have to say. That's what I'm thinking right now.
That is so amazing. I have been asking the same question about this focus on Britney Spears. It's like, who cares? You know, there's so many things that we have to care about all around the world and in our own communities. And yeah, and that was really well said. And I'm glad you brought that up. There's actually a question that I think would be good. We're moving into maybe having a conversation. You can ask each other questions, but this one was, what tools do you see as most useful for making food available to all and also paying those producing the food fairly? What would be the tools that would get us there? Who would like to start with that? You're muted, Molly. You're still.
Niaz could certainly talk about the Disparity to Parity project, which is a great example, but it's an interesting question to me because I met with a fellow in Middlebury just last week who's really interested in making local food more available to low-income people and BIPOC people in our community. And he points out that local food is often more expensive than the food that they're able to get at Shaw's or Hannaford's, or for people in other parts of the country, the chain supermarkets. And of course, the food is less expensive in those places because the externalities are all being, they aren't being absorbed in the cost of the food. So you aren't paying the full cost of environmental degradation that was involved in producing that food. that you get from the supermarket or the very low wages that are being paid to workers. So there are a lot of different models that are being tried around the country. And I told this fellow who I met with last week that I would start collecting models of how people around the country are making local food more available to everyone. Of course, I am interested in making sure that this is done in such a way that it's not cutting into parity. It's not cutting into the prices that farmers need to receive in order to make a living, to make a decent living and to cover their operating costs. And it's just shameful in our country that so few farmers, particularly small scale farmers, are able to make a living from farming. They are going out and driving a school bus, or somebody in their family is working as a nurse in order to get health insurance, to get a pension, to get the things that most of the rest of us consider to be pretty important just for surviving. So there are a lot of models. One model that I'm really interested in is the model of the commons, where land is held collectively. And I would love to see affordable housing combined with land commons, where people would have, people who want to work the land would have a place to live that's energy efficient, that's pleasant, aesthetically pleasing, close to where they're working. But the profits from the commons are shared among all the people who are working the land. And the way that they work the land is also shared. They decide together how that land will be managed. So the commons is a really interesting model that I would love to see explored more. Of course, there are a lot of other kind of wealth redistribution tactics in place. For instance, CSAs that charge wealthy people a little bit more and have free shares available to low-income people, or subsidies that are given to low-income people either through government payments or through something like Double Up Bucks, which is the program that started in Massachusetts. Similar programs everywhere where low-income people can buy vegetables and get twice as much for the value of their money as what they would pay without that program in place. And I see that people are popping some great examples into the chat, like gleaning. That's something that is done. It's a very old practice. And there's a lovely film by Agnes Varda, a French woman called The Gleaners, that looks at gleaning, and she connects it in with dumpster diving and with people who are trying to live off the food that other people are not using. And I am certainly not an advocate of saying that food waste should be given to low-income people, that we should be closing the loop in that way. I think low-income people should be getting exactly the same choices and the same healthy food that other people do. We just need to make sure that they are getting decent wages so that they can afford that food. So I feel like I've kind of rambled off on a few tangents here, but this is one of the things that I'm really obsessed with right now, how to make local food more affordable to everyone.
Great. Thanks, Molly. And would you put in the chat the name of that film?
Yes, of course.
Be great. That would be great. So Brian or Niaz, anything to add to this, or I'm sure you have things.
I'll
to
add a little bit. I think for me, I can't answer that question without first questioning the cost of food and who is usurping the power and profit in our food system today. Otherwise, we're kind of fixing the wrong problem. The problem is the middle of the chain has lost its purpose. It has gone from being the entity that was connecting us with the source of food to becoming the usurpers of power and profit. And I will use a couple of examples. Actually, one example is really vivid for me. Working with fishermen, seafood is, in my opinion, artificially expensive. And it's not because it is expensive for the fishermen to catch, it's because the middle of the chain has capitalized on the way we think about seafood and is making us as eaters feel like we have to pay a lot for that seafood because somehow it's just really expensive to get. Over a few years, lobstermen here in New England were making $2, $3 a pound for their lobsters when they were catching them. How much was any individual here paying for lobsters if you were lucky enough in some ways financially to be able to eat them? Yet they're broke. And yet lobsters are a luxury item that are sold by the middle of the chain at really high prices. But we don't have to focus on lobsters. We can talk about basic foods. What this pandemic revealed to me is if we address that fundamental problem or that fundamental question, we actually can see that good food is affordable and that anybody can get access to it if they know where to go. Here in Massachusetts, a program was started called Mass Food Delivery. They're based in central Massachusetts, and they've started to aggregate food from various farmers, fishermen, livestock folks, even value-added, making tinctures and whatever, prepared foods. And you place your order and they deliver it to you. There is a delivery charge of $10, but I found as I look at what they sell, in some way, many of those items are actually cheaper than what I could get at a supermarket. But somehow we think the supermarket, I remember as a kid thinking, oh, we can go and buy from a supermarket. Somehow we had status because we could go to the supermarket. We could get prepared foods from a supermarket because it was a sign of progress and status. Yet now here I can get food directly from farmers, fishermen at costs that are lower because the middle of the chain, being mass food delivery, has prioritized giving those food providers their cost of operation and making sure their food is affordable to us so as long as they can recover their basic costs. There are many programs like that that have popped up around the country on a hyper local to a much broader level. And I hope that we take away, and in the meanwhile, it's really worth noting that status quo system, the usurpers of power and profit, collapsed. They have promised us everything over the last few decades. We are the ones who are going to feed you. You will never go without because we've got millions of chicken coming to your supermarket. They collapsed. Their workers got sick. They had to kill their animals in those farms that they had contracts with. They had to bury under vegetables. They collapsed and were unable to fulfill their promise while the system that had been in place for a long time, yet not literally, but what's the other word? Buried in itself, these local aggregators that are feeding us and providing income for food providers, they started to really get lifted up. I hope that we find it in ourselves to not think going back to normal is jettisoning these new businesses that have been feeding us for the last year and a half, and going back to normal being the supermarket that's charging you more money that you should be paying for food that's probably not good for you. Those systems exist, and there are different models. The disparity to parity project that Molly talked about is really our way of showing the disparity in the economic system, and all those costs that Molly talked about that are not incorporated in our current food system, whether it's the cost of treating the land poorly or polluting too much, or the way we treat the animals, or the way we treat the humans. So all of those there are a bunch of essays on the website that kind of get at the different parts of the disparity and the solutions that can bring about parity. And I'm all for gleaning, and I'm all for all those systems that are community-based and individuals decide to take individual actions. But we really have to get at the root of why this is a problem to begin with. not only when it comes to the food providers and what they're getting paid and our access to it, but the other point that Molly brought up, why is it that we don't have in our society, we don't honor people enough to pay them a livable wage so they can afford good food? Those two things together have to be the fundamental things we look at before we think about any solutions. Otherwise, I predict we're going to just keep creating tomorrow's problems with our solutions, with our so-called solutions.
Oh, yeah. Thank you so much for that, Nias.
I-
I bet Brian has something to offer here.
Yeah, actually, this is where most of Ulceri's work has been for the last 17 years. Over the last 4 years, we've built 17 high tunnels. We've got a design for Walapinis, which are fortified greenhouses, so that we can stretch our growing season. Because in South Dakota, we got about 6 months a year to grow food. And the Walapinis allow us to grow year round without a lot of other carbon costs to do this. And like the pandemic, the reservation is like a really isolated place. We have 4 or 5 convenience stores and 1 grocery store on 2.2 million acres serving 54,000 people.
Wow.
So when the pandemic hit and we sealed our borders, we couldn't get access to food. I mean, we were cut off. And but we had written the Lakota plan. So we had a response. And so myself and the other organizations like Ulceri went out and we started tilling gardens. Ulceri, we put in over 170 gardens. We provided over 30,000 plant starts for those gardens. And we were able to have a ready response to the pandemic. Now, there's a lot of pieces to this. And like the future goals for what we're doing is a housing project based around the Earthship design homes, Earthship style. So you have some garden space through the gray water systems in every household. And there's some legislative pieces that need to be tackled too, because big farms are rewarded for doing kind of a crappy job. They get extra money for killing those animals and not taking them to market. And this is a designed shortage of foods to the supermarkets. And the labor was all forced to stay home. And so the supply chain broke. And we weren't able to get, basic supples like hamburger and some really basic needs kind of stuff. And so localizing this food systems and getting the knowledge out there, focusing on the economic piece of it, I think is almost a step backwards in a lot of ways, because how to say this exactly? Money is a means to harvest soul, the spiritual power of the human being, right? That's how we create these dragons, because you make an agreement to do something for money, and you add in the Federal Reserve. They're creating $100 with $103 worth of debt on that $100 they create. There's no way to ever repay that. So they're harvesting these $3 that can never be repaid. These are the grand dragons. They're harvesting the human potential and setting on it. And so there is no fair trade when you involve finance in these things. There's always somebody siphoning off the human potential before it ever really gets started. It's a less than zero sum. And that's where the GDP comes from, right? So how do we address that?
well, this gift economy, okay, traditionally, the richest people in the tribe did do the giveaways. And there's this mirror image, e pluribus unum, it's on all of the money, right? And then there's a bunch of other satanic things that they use to harvest soul power. And they accumulate that to give them more power over time, because they're creating $100 with $103 worth of debt. So they build this up. So that's where these billionaires and trillionaires and all this other BS comes from. If we are focusing on the financial end of the production of agriculture and getting food to people, then we're perpetuating this ourselves. Where if we focus, like Osiri uses some symbols, we use the triangle, but in the opposite, a mirror image of the all-seeing eye and the triangle, the corporate triangle, and it's inverted because the leadership is at the bottom upholding the people, and you get this massive amount of force at the end of that triangle. We call it moving the herd. If we can get everybody on the same kind of mindset, this 300-year march to a better world, then when we say herd, we're not talking about a sheep herd that is placidly going where we want. We're talking about like a buffalo herd with their wild, terraforming ways that can harvest the potential of the human spirit, and we can change everything. Okay. And if we're not focusing on accumulating wealth as individuals, but rather to release that potential so that everything can grow, then we have something. I mean, this is using the servant leadership models where people are able to uphold other people and other oyates, the four-legged, the two-legged, the winged, those kind of things. And we can actually make a real difference. But if we focus on this financial thing and our individual powers, then it's my belief that we're working backwards. We're actually scuttling ourselves by focusing on this financial model. And I won't take up any more time.
No, this is really important. This is a very important conversation, and it's brought out a lot of comments in the chat. Brian, can you turn on the light in your car?
Sure. That better?
Yes, we can
Sorry
see.
about that.
Great, thank you. So I'm wondering if the three of you have any questions for each other, or we can just switch over to questions from people. So if people have a question, you can write it in the chat, or you can use the reaction, the hand raising by that, the mechanical Zoom hand raising, so that you could actually ask your question in person.
If you don't mind, there was a comment actually in the chat about fisheries.
Yes, go
I
for it.
would love to dig a little bit deeper into it.
Okay, can you repeat what it was?
Yeah, the comment was about overfishing, which I don't disagree with. But I also want to, the reason this work of connecting farmers and fishermen with each other works for me is because I see a lot of parallels. Same parallel as when pigs are held in captivity in confined animal feedlots in factory farms versus industrial factory fishing operations. There are fishermen who are working at very small scale, very ecosystem oriented, and they really focus on diversity of species. The other model is industrial operations that are focused on single species extraction. I don't call that fishing. That is another extractive activity. And that is the activity that is considered efficient enough to be valued by the current system, because the current system rewards volume over value. The current system says you should all eat farm salmon because we can grow them in humongous numbers, even if we destroy ecosystems to grow this single species of fish, which we killed off the Atlantic salmon because we put dams in the rivers and because we ate them all. And so now we want to grow them in the equivalent of factory fishing farms because we can't seem to stop our appetite for salmon. Yet there are fishermen in the Pacific Northwest catching salmon as in a sustainable way, on a very ecosystem-based way, and they can't get their fish into the marketplace because that industrial farm salmon, the volume brings down the value. So the eaters say, why would I pay this much for that salmon that's caught in the wild by a small boat if I can get this farm salmon for $3 a pound? That's the externalized cost that Molly was talking about. That farm salmon comes with cost that the wild salmon already includes in its cost. So for me, there is a difference between people who fish and people who extract seafood. And there's a difference between eating marine animals and diversity of species versus demanding certain species 12 months out of the year, the same way we've been demanding strawberries 12 months out of the year. Guess what? That strawberry you eat in December here in New England tastes like crap. It doesn't taste like strawberries, and it was grown with pesticides. It is not one that you would want to put in your mouth any more than the fish that you want to put in your mouth, even though you want to honor it because we kill it. But we're catching it out of cycles of nature because we're focusing on that volume and the demand to have it 12 months out of the year. So my suggestion to those who want to eat seafood and feel better about eating seafood is to apply the same values you apply to your chickens and your tomatoes and your pigs and your lettuce to your seafood. Eat diversity of species, eat seafood that's in season. Fish do have seasons. They swim in cycles. They come to shore during certain times a year. And it wasn't until we decided that we could build big enough boats to go to them when they're running away from us is when we started to hunt for those fish during times that we shouldn't be catching them. And eat fish that looks like fish. Don't eat fish sticks. Don't eat fake seafood. Don't eat industrial farmed fish. And stay away from what I call the 4Fs, fake, factory, farmed. I used to add frozen in there, but now I see the value of frozen fish that comes to us from different places. So apply those values and eat about fish that's about as close to you as possible. And when I say that, people often say, what are people in Iowa going to eat? And I don't know why it's always Iowa, but I always have to remind people that Iowans had bison, had local species, had animals and vegetables and ecosystems that fed them till we destroyed it. We don't have to rely on the ocean to feed everybody everywhere. We have foods that we have destroyed our ability to get access to them because of that high volume, low value systems that we've come to value over the years through our current value system. So let Iowa get back its land and its animals and the native species and the native vegetables that it used to be able to eat. And then we can talk about what fish can we bring to Iowa from the other coasts.
Well, I think there are rivers and streams in Iowa, so there must be fish there. And if the water is healthy, possibly those fish are healthy too. So they could have.
That's right. And that's where agribusiness come in. That's where fracking comes in. That's where toxic pollution comes in. That is where sources of human activity for wanting more and more and more comes in. So how do we tame that? And I see that Cat Rose, there's a lot of grief in food. I totally hear you. I work with people who often are ankle deep in blood because of the animals that they have to kill for the rest of us to eat. I know there is grief in food, and there is something that we reconcile with at some point, because again, it goes back to choice. It goes back to some people don't have any other options but to eat the fish that they have to kill or the chicken that has to be killed. We have to honor those choices, and the rest of us need to pay closer attention to the kind of grief that we are causing through the choices we make.
Yeah.
I'm reminded of a couple of things. One is the way that we force other people to do our dirty work for us. We want them to do the killing, the butchering, the slaughtering, the standing in blood, the yanking chickens off the assembly line, so that we can have cheap chicken, but we're not willing to really pay them decent wages. And I'm also thinking about that beautiful film Sawamim that I think there was a session about it this afternoon, wasn't
Right.
there, Rua? And it's about dams, well, Shasta Dam in California. Is it Northern California?
It is around now Mount Shasta.
Okay, but just a lovely film about the tribe that was dependent on salmon and their lives were completely interwoven with the salmon until Shasta Dam was built, and it flooded their territory and meant that the salmon could no longer come upstream. And one of the real takeaway lessons of that film, which I recommend that all of you watch, it's not a long film and it's really powerful, but one of the takeaway lessons is that we have to see food as sacred, and we have to see our interrelationship, our interdependence in the whole web of life, that we lose health, we lose spirit if we are starting to look at food and nature as just things that serve us.
And that's interesting because one of the questions or thoughts in the chat was, I wonder what this conversation would look like if we were taking the greater than human world into consideration. Per the last workshop, what are the rights of salmon, of water? And Sawamen means sacred water.
Sacred water.
Yeah. So, but I think we have touched on that greater piece of it. It's a respect for all life, and that we lose everything. We lose our souls by not seeing that we're at one with everything in the world.
And I would extend that concept of equity. We've talked mainly about the equity among people, but I think we need to extend it to other creatures too. There's no real reason other than the fact that we see through human eyes. There's no reason to put ourselves as being unique and distinct and superior to other creatures. We need those creatures.
So I'm wondering, Brian, if you have something to add to this.
Yeah, Lakota way, when we end our prayers and things, we say Mitakoyase, and it means we are all related. In the bigger picture of things, there's this by Rosalie. You can find it on YouTube. But what it does is she has rolled up like our spiritual ways over, eons, and it starts with a nagi, which is your spirit or it's your heart, your soul, those kind of things. And then it goes out to Tiwahe, Tiushbae, Oyate, and goes out all the way out to Wakantanka, the Great Mystery. And in those things, when you get to the Oyate level, then everything is equal. So when you use this litmus test to tell what is right or what is wrong as you go, we all have the same importance. Because if you look, you know, when we look at the world normally, we look at it from a human perspective.
I think you're frozen.
What if we look at it from the viewpoint of what if the world is everything is focused around a bird, or if it's focused around a horse or a bison, and what is your world view from that point? I mean, doesn't that really change how you're looking at what the importance of decisions are? I mean, we as human beings have a responsibility to take care of those things. We're caretakers overall. And
She's not here.
we don't have anything above any other animal. We have a responsibility to make sure that everything is equal, has an equal shot at the environment around us. I mean, Lakota way, that is how we live. That's how we think. Over the next generations.
I'm sorry, Brian, you keep coming in and out. Are you traveling now?
Yeah, we are. And
Yeah.
we're kind of losing our signal. Sorry.
Yeah. I'm sorry. I know you have a lot to offer here. We only have about another 15 minutes of your sharing before I close. Is there any way of parking for a bit in a good spot so you can continue being part of the conversation? Maybe they'll try that.
Yeah, we're trying to find a space.
Okay. So one of the questions I had is, well, not a question, but asking you to make the connection between local, regional food systems and mitigation of climate change. How are those things related?
Well, that's an easy question, really. The healthiest ways to grow food are by using agroecological practices, which also sequester a lot of carbon in the soil. So if we switch to that and away from industrial farming, which is exploitative, extractive, taking carbon out of the soil, disturbing the soil, or with no-till farming, which is used increasingly in industrial farming systems, but always with doses of herbicides, which are hurting the microorganisms in the soil. I was struck, I've been mulling over a question that Lori Sherman put in the chat about how do we return to the land when so many have become accustomed to agri-farming and corporate farming. And also there's so many people on the planet now. Is there enough healthy farmable land left? And how do we make the federal government stop supporting the unsustainable farming methods, which are actually three things. You might not know, but Bill Gates is the biggest owner of farmland in the United States now. He owns 47,000 acres, and we could grow a lot of healthy food on that land if Bill Gates could be convinced to just give up all that excessive wealth that he has accumulated. So there's one place we could get good farmland. by stepping up and taxing people who are getting away with not paying taxes. That they're basically parasites on society. They aren't paying their fair share at all, yet taking benefits from society. And there is plenty of land left if people are not exploiting and using it in the ridiculous ways that we've started using it for industrial farming with vast monocultures of one crop. There's plenty to go around for everyone. We really do live in a world of abundance, even with the population that we have now, 7.5 billion people. There's plenty for everyone if people are not taking too much. But that's the problem. People are taking too much, and it's us, our society, that's taking too much. It's
Mhm.
very hard within our society to start taking a reasonable amount because all of the systems around us force us into using too much energy. For instance, there's not public transportation. So it's really hard to get around if you live in a rural area without using a car. And there's a lot of embedded energy in that car, even if it's an electric car. So I could go on and on with that, but I'll give Niaz a chance to talk too.
Thanks, Molly. I'll just layer on to what Molly had said. A couple of thoughts come to mind, and this also takes us back to the conversation around equity, which is return of infrastructure. To be able to manage what you catch, grow, raise within a certain reasonable distance of where that food is raised, caught, or grown can actually reduce the carbon footprint and the climate impact of that food. We had an interesting experience when we first started really talking about fisheries or seafood in a localized fashion. One of our, what we called our early adopters, was actually University of Vermont Medical Center. We worked with Diane Emery and her team to change their seafood buying purchases. And what they found was that they were buying seafood that was considered by the acceptable standards sustainable. That's Marine Stewardship Council and the red, yellow, green list, which we don't consider to be sustainable ways of measuring sustainability. Anyway, they were buying this fish that was considered sustainable off of factory fishing operations in the Bering Sea, was ending up somewhere in China to be processed and then brought back. And these are fish, and the reason they were going there is because they were predictable. They were predictable white blocks that they knew what to do with. So we began to introduce them to local seafood and the diversity of species and becoming a little bit more adventurous, just as they had become with their agriculture-based food. And Diane Emery and her team talk about this often when we give presentations together, that once they made that choice, they reduced their impact from they reduced their carbon footprint from something around 6,000 or 7,000 miles to less than 1,000 miles. And so when we have infrastructure in place, that not only reduces the amount of fuel we have to use to move things around from raw products to products that are ready for us to use, but when it comes to animal livestock, it's less stressful on those animals as well. And that goes back to animal equity. If we're choosing to eat them, we have to honor their lives and take good care of them. And transferring a cow or a pig or a chicken hundreds of miles, if not more, in stressful conditions without care so that they can be slaughtered for cheap stuff, not only adds a carbon footprint or adds to our climate burden, but it's also not honoring the lives of those animals. So there's that infrastructure piece is becoming more and more and more important when it comes to addressing the climate challenges we have in food production.
Mhm. Thank you. That is so important. Excuse me. Brian, are you with us or not?
Yes,
Yes,
just kind of get into a spot where we can get a little better signal.
this is sounding pretty good right at the moment.
Okay, yeah, we're just about to pull in here, so, can you give me the parameters again? Not
Are
sure.
are you talking to us about parameters?
Yeah, on this particular block.
Hey, Brian, we can't see you. If you turn your camera off, it might make your signal better. Now we can see you a little bit.
Yeah. Just,
Repeat the question.
well, I was asking how local food, regional foods help mitigate climate change. And it's a really basic question that has prompted a lot of other discussion.
Okay, so the work we're doing with Ulceri, with, producing with Ulceri and the additional partners, we put in, I don't know, there's like 400 and some gardens went in after the pandemic. And it was really helpful. I mean, the pandemic has really shown us a lot of different issues with the supply system. And it's really turned on a lot of lights for people that, we can't depend on this factory farming supplied system, because everything is trucked in here. Everything is cheap calories. And then, so like pallets are changing now, where people preferred to drink sodas and they preferred to eat noodles and things like that. Then mindsets are changing. So a lot of things have changed with the pandemic because it's shined a light on the problems. And we started a local slaughterhouse so that our producers can take livestock to a local butcher, and then most of the local producer is selling to the local peoples, and that's helped a lot. And with the gardens too, I mean, we're still working on it, getting the produce moved from one place on the reservation to another, because our reservation is a block of land that's 100 miles by 200 miles with 54,000 residents. And so we have to move, like some places will grow tomatoes and fruiting vegetables very well. Others will grow tubers very well. So connecting people and those relationships are really huge in this stuff too, right? Because you got to know people, and then adding in appropriate technologies like the Wallapeenies. In one of our partners built an earthship house, and then they grew a banana tree, and then that banana tree produced bananas, right? And we were able to harvest them. And then so these things that are normally shipped in from way down south and take hundreds of gallons of fuel to get here, we can produce locally. And these Wallapeenies have really changed the overall look of what local food is. You're not just stuck to a set amount of garden stuff. Now you can produce cucumbers and avocados and banana trees and all of those kind of things, but they're more of a delicacy that we can use, and we can produce it locally. So, I mean, my ultimate goal is to create the most sustainable community on the planet, and then catch everybody else up if I possibly can. And I'm not scuttled by finances at this point, because I'm not focusing on that. We do one project at a time, one family at a time, and we grow our allyship so that we can help to make this thing much larger than just what I physically can do. I mean, we connect with people, we share our knowledge with people, and then they're able to plan their own things, and we assist where we can, how we can. I mean, that's how the old tribal systems worked, because there wasn't any money. There was no way to go and stop human initiative and like management practices for the other Oyates. shared knowledge, open discussions on things. And so I
Mhm.
don't have a whole lot more to add from there. I mean, that's what we're doing. Happy to collaborate with anybody that wants to know what or how at any time, you know.
Great. Thank you so much. You know what I'm hearing here is that the thread when I'm listening to you, Brian, now is about community, about connection. And
Oh,
you know that this is what food does too. It brings us together. And when you're talking about the fisheries, Niaz, it's not like each person who is working in that industry or working for themselves has to work at this alone, but that it doesn't work that way, that they have to form a community in order to make the changes that are necessary so that it is a sustainable resource rather than one that we're depleting. And also what Molly talked about, you know, the food co-ops, the cooperatives, the where smaller farms are working together to bring, you come to a farmer's market there here in Vermont, one of the local farmers markets, there are farmers there from all over that have small farms that are each bringing both produce and value-added foods. So it's community that is really the future of food. And I think it was Wendell Berry, maybe Lewis could tell me that California didn't have farms, they have factories. And that's a whole different approach.
It was from a biodynamics.
So he says it was from a biodynamics book that he read. But I think that's where we have what we've lost. Farming is about a connection to the soil, the community that all lives within the soil, the non-human community that lives in the area, and then the human community as well. And I've heard that thread in all of this discussion. So I'm wondering if anyone wants to share a few words of wisdom before I do my little goodbye. Anybody?
That's asking a lot. Words of wisdom at 10 o'clock at night.
I know,
which is what it is our time. But I think we have to remember that aspect of the spirit too, that has to infuse our sense of the community, that it's spirit and it's love for all those other beings that with whom we are interdependent.
Yeah, beautifully said. Any other last words, either Niaz or Brian?
Well, I'm struck by something that, again, I go back to, I think it was Kat who said there's so much grief. There's a lot of grief in the world. There's a lot of grief in our food system. It's hard to see beyond it sometimes. But one of the elements of food is joy. It's nourishment. It is community. In our language, when the Bon Appetit version is Nusha Jan, which means food of life. Food is life-giving, and I think the practice of providing food is a life-giving practice, even though there are moments when life is taken in order for life to be given. So I think to remember that there is a lot of joy beyond that grief. There is a lot of community already there. And for us to recognize that and tap into that, because we got a lot of work to do. Our work is immense. And if we let the grief bring us down and we don't allow the food system to be a life-giving element for us, then it's going to be, we're going to lose each other. And we need everybody in this fight. And that is where the joy needs to come in to the picture.
Oh, yes, beautifully said. Thank you. Brian, any last words?
There's so much in that. It's hard to come up with just any small thing, but gratitude is a huge thing. Gratitude for those things that you get and the things that you give, and humbleness. We don't have all the answers, and being able to reach out for help when you need it. Because Siri isn't just me. Well, Siri is this collaboration of people from all over. I mean, literally all over the world. People travel here. I'm not a big media presence, but somehow people find me here in the middle of South Dakota on the edge of the Badlands. And they come by the hundreds to come and listen to folks like you all. And, my little bit of inputs, and just to share that knowledge and then take it back to their communities. I mean, Mitakoyase, we are all related. All of these things are related.
Yes.
Brian, could you tell us one more time what Siri stands for?
All Siri.
Old Siri is Oglala Lakota Cultural Economic Revitalization Initiative. Siri is a kind of an offshoot of that. That's where we collaborate with other communities, because other communities are not Oglala Lakota. So those are just where we're sharing information with folks.
Thank you.
So I want to thank the three of you. For those of us on the East Coast, I want to especially thank all of us for staying up past my bedtime. I'm the early to bed, early to rise person. But I just really appreciate what you had to offer here. You all had wisdom and knowledge, and just seeing the chat, I know people are very appreciative for spending your time here with us. So thank you. And I would like all the participants to please complete a participant survey. It's more than how did you like the workshop? It's also, is this a topic that you want to continue talking about in the future? And so that's a way of connecting with other people around the topic. And Kat is going to put the feedback form there in the chat that you can fill out. And I will email people as well to remind them, or connect through Mighty Networks. That's not true email, but whatever. So, and thank you, Kat. She was the best tech host. You don't know what she did for me behind the scenes in the chat to me to make sure everything was working just right. So thank you, everybody. I hope you have a wonderful evening. Thanks for stopping. How did you get into daylight, Brian? You were in darkness, total darkness, then just a car light, and suddenly you're in daylight. And I know it's like 8 o'clock where you are.
You got beamed.
We pulled into a gas station.
Ah, yay. Well, thanks for doing that. I'm glad. It's nice to see your face when you're talking and not to have you broken up.
And thanks to folks for the great comments in the chat. Really appreciate that.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
All right. Good night, everybody.
Everyone.
Uh,
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Thank you.